Limestone County, Alabama, March 1860. A bitter wind sliced through the darkness on the night Reverend Calvin Fletcher made the decision that would define his life. He stood at the periphery of his modest wooden church, his hands unsteady, observing 12 spectral figures moving through the shadows at his back. 12 individuals who, by the law of the land, had no right to exist as free people. 12 human souls to whom he had just pledged a path toward what most considered a fantasy liberty. His wife had pleaded with him to reconsider. His congregation had cautioned him. Even his own conscience had murmured that a white preacher had no business entangling himself in such peril. But 3 weeks prior, Calvin had witnessed an event that seared through his comfortable faith, forcing upon him a question that now poisoned his sleep. Could a man truly consider himself a servant of God while averting his eyes from those who cried out for deliverance? That night, in a county where cotton was king and human beings were chattel, one preacher resolved his answer. What he could not yet fathom was that his choice would ignite a sequence of events so ruthless, so merciless, that it would reverberate through the conscience of all who learned of it. For in Alabama, in the year 1860, aiding an enslaved person to freedom was not merely illegal, it was a transgression that white society would neither forget nor forgive. And Calvin Fletcher was destined to learn the precise weight of that condemnation. Alabama in 1860 was not a landscape where compassion resided easily. It was a territory where dynasties were erected upon the broken backs of the enslaved, where the hue of one's skin dictated whether you were regarded as a person or as property, and where to question this order was to invite mortal danger. Limestone County occupied the northern reaches of the state, near enough to the Tennessee border that whispers of it circulated among the enslaved as a potential corridor northward. But proximity to Tennessee did not equate to safety. It meant heightened patrols, deepened suspicion, and more armed men who viewed their sacred duty as the preservation of the peculiar institution, whatever the cost. Calvin Fletcher was not an Alabaman by birth. He had arrived from Pennsylvania 15 years earlier, a young minister brimming with fervor and conviction, believing he could harvest souls for Christ in the deep South. He had married a local woman named Margaret, built a humble church for poor white farmers, and endeavored to assimilate into a society that felt fundamentally alien to the Christian love he'd been taught to preach. For years, he kept his gaze lowered, sermonizing on salvation and sin, artfully avoiding the subject everyone knew was fracturing the nation. But 3 weeks before that fateful March night, Calvin beheld a scene that irrevocably altered him. At a neighboring plantation owned by a man named Cyrus Thornhill, he saw an enslaved woman named Sarah collapse in the cotton field. She was 8 months pregnant and had been laboring since dawn. When she fell, the overseer did not call for aid. He called her indolent. He raised his whip, and when Calvin shouted for him to desist, the overseer fixed the preacher with a look of pure, uncomprehending contempt. That evening, Calvin found he could not pray, could not eat, could no longer pretend that silence was a virtue. He had spent his entire adult life proclaiming that every soul held immeasurable value in the eyes of God. Now, he had to determine if he actually believed it. Cyrus Thornhill served as the antagonist of this narrative, though he would have scoffed at the designation. In his own estimation, he was merely a pragmatist. He owned 43 human beings, worked them to exhaustion, fed them sparingly, and when they broke, he replaced them. Simple economics. Thornhill possessed pale, unblinking eyes and a reputation for cruelty that kept even fellow plantation owners at a cautious remove. In a world constructed upon brutality, there were still tacit lines. Cyrus Thornhill crossed them all, deliberately and without remorse. Calvin Fletcher did not transform into a conductor on the Underground Railroad in a single epiphany. His metamorphosis occurred in fragments, through small surrenders of the security he had built. First came the private interrogations in the dark hours. Then came the fraught conversations with Margaret, who wept and clasped his hands and confessed her terror of what might befall them. Then arrived the moment he sought out a free black man named Joseph Reed, a carpenter dwelling on the town's fringe, whose eyes held depths of knowledge and secrecy Calvin was only beginning to perceive. Joseph did not trust him initially. Why would he? White preachers were adept at quoting scripture about brotherly love, yet most discovered elegant theological justifications for slavery. Some even proclaimed it a divine ordinance. So when Calvin appeared at Joseph's door one evening and stated his desire to help, Joseph studied him for a protracted, silent moment before speaking. "Help how?" Joseph inquired. Calvin had no detailed answer. He only knew inaction had become a spiritual impossibility. It was Joseph who elucidated the mechanics of hope. He spoke of routes, safe houses, and signals, of how the enslaved sometimes ran, and of the scattered network of individuals, black and white, who hazarded everything to assist them. Joseph told Calvin about Sarah, the pregnant woman from Thornhill's field. He revealed she had already lost 2 children. He explained her husband had been sold down the river 6 months prior, and he disclosed that Sarah intended to run as soon as she delivered her baby, preferring to die striving for free soil than to watch another child be forged in chains. Hearing this, Calvin felt some final interior barrier shatter. A last vestige of self-preservation crumbled to dust. He looked at Joseph and uttered words he could never retract. "Tell me what to do." What followed were weeks of meticulous, clandestine preparation. Joseph introduced Calvin to others in the network. People whose names the preacher was never told, whose faces he deliberately tried not to memorize. They outlined the routes, the timing, the mortal dangers. They described the night patrols, the dogs bred to hunt human scent, the federal laws that rendered the aiding of a fugitive a serious crime. They told him that white accomplices who were caught faced mob justice, tar and feathers, or worse. They detailed every conceivable catastrophe. Calvin absorbed it all. And then he said yes. The plan coalesced in fragments. Sarah's baby arrived in late February, a tiny girl she named Grace. For 2 weeks Sarah gathered her strength. Concurrently, Joseph and his contacts identified 11 others ready to seize this chance. They were field hands from 3 different plantations, individuals who had been waiting, watching, and praying for an opportunity they understood might never come again. The network sent word north, arranged a chain of safe houses, secured meager supplies, and Calvin offered his church. The church stood a quarter-mile from town encircled by woods. It contained a small cellar unknown to most, a space formerly used by Calvin's predecessor for storing root vegetables. Now it would conceal human beings. Calvin spent a week preparing it, smuggling in blankets, water, and hardtack. He did not confess the full scope to Margaret, but she knew. She watched him work, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks, comprehending both his purpose and the potential price. The appointed night arrived with startling swiftness. A message came at sunset: "They are coming tonight. Be ready." Calvin stood alone in his church for an hour before their arrival, praying with a raw desperation unfamiliar to him. These were not the polished petitions of seminary, but guttural, pleading utterances. "Please, let me do this rightly. Keep them safe. Do not let my weakness fail them." They emerged from the darkness without sound, shadows moving within shadows. Joseph led them, and behind him trailed 12 individuals carrying nothing but a terrifying, fragile hope. Sarah cradled baby Grace, swaddled in a thin shawl. A man named Thomas walked with a pronounced limp, the legacy of an old whipping. 2 teenage sisters, Ruth and Esther, clung to one another. An older man called Uncle James moved with deliberate care, favoring his left side where ribs had been broken and never properly set. Each bore wounds Calvin could not see. Each had summoned a courage he could scarcely comprehend. He met them at the rear door. Their eyes held a torrent of silent questions. "Can we trust you? Will you truly help us? Or are you merely another white man who will betray us?" Calvin opened the door wider. "Come inside," he said. "You are safe here." A safe was a relative term. They had, at most, 6 hours before their absence was noted. 6 hours before the alarm was raised. 6 hours before every white man in 3 counties would be hunting them. They descended into the cellar, a cramped, cold space. Sarah held Grace close, whispering assurances to her infant, making promises she was not certain she could keep. Calvin brought food, coarse bread, dried meat, water. It was a paltry offering, but they ate as if at a feast. Some had not had a full meal in days. Others were too gripped by fear to eat at all. Uncle James sat in a corner, eyes closed. Calvin could not tell if he was praying or merely steeling himself against the pain. Margaret ventured down once. Her gaze swept over the faces in the gloom, over Sarah and Grace, over the clasped hands of Ruth and Esther. Then she looked at Calvin, and in her eyes he saw not only fear, but a dawning fierce pride. A recognition that the man she married was finally becoming the man he had always professed to be. She brought additional blankets. She placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "God be with you," she whispered before retreating upstairs lest her composure break. The strategy was to wait until an hour before dawn, then move north in small separate parties. Joseph had arranged wagons at 2 discrete locations. From there, the journey would proceed through a sequence of safe houses in Tennessee, pushing ever northward. It was a route with prior successes, but each journey was a gamble. Every mile held peril. Every moment contained the potential for disaster. They waited. The cellar was airless and cold. Baby Grace fussed, and Sarah rocked her gently, terrified the sound would travel. Thomas tested his bad leg, wondering if it would sustain the coming flight. Ruth and Esther exchanged whispers too faint for Calvin to decipher. Uncle James sat motionless, gathering his resolve. Calvin remained upstairs watching the road. Every distant sound clenched his heart. Every shifting shadow resembled a patrol. He was a preacher who had spent a lifetime discussing faith. Now he was discovering its exacting cost. Near midnight, a rider approached on the road. Calvin's stomach turned to lead. He watched through the window as the man slowed near the church, scanned the surroundings, then continued on his way. Just a farmer returning home late. Yet Calvin's hands trembled for 10 minutes afterward. Margaret sat with him, offering the solace of her presence. They had been married 12 years, surviving privation and judgment, but nothing had tested them like this. "If they catch us," Margaret said, her voice scarcely audible, "they will destroy everything we have." Hugh Calvin nodded. He knew the church would be burned, they would be driven out, or worse. "I know." Margaret took his hand. "I am not saying you should stop. I am saying I understand the cost, and I am with you." In that moment, Calvin felt a profound grace settle over him. He was not alone. 3 hours before dawn, Joseph returned, moving through the woods with preternatural silence. His coded knock came at the door. Calvin opened it. "We have a complication," Joseph said, and Calvin's blood chilled. "What sort?" "Thornhill knows. There was an informant. He has men on every northern road, inspecting every wagon and traveler. They are looking for Sarah specifically." Oh, of course they were. Sarah, to Cyrus Thornhill, was prime breeding stock, a young woman who had just proven her resilience. He would not relinquish such an asset lightly. Calvin met Joseph's steady gaze. "What is your counsel?" While Joseph was silent for a beat. "We divide them. The majority proceed north as planned, but by altered, dispersed routes. But Sarah and the infant, they cannot travel now. A newborn's cries would betray them at the first checkpoint. We must conceal them here until the search abates." Calvin absorbed the weight of this new reality. Hiding them here prolonged the danger. Sending them out guaranteed capture. For how long? Joseph shook his head. A week, a month. There is no predicting it. Calvin descended to the cellar. He found Sarah Grace sleeping in her arms and knelt beside her. "Sarah," he said softly, "the plan must change." Her eyes widened with immediate understanding. Calvin explained the patrols, the heightened danger, the stark choice. The others would depart as intended, but she and Grace must remain. Sarah was quiet for a long interval. When she spoke, her words would engrave themselves upon Calvin's soul. "Reverend," she whispered, "I have been enslaved all my life, beaten, sold, used as if I were not human. I have buried 2 children. I lost my husband to the auction block. All I have left in this world is this child in my arms. You are asking me to trust you, a white man I scarcely know, with our very lives. That is a mighty hard thing you are asking." So Calvin could only nod. "I know it is." Sarah looked down at Grace's sleeping face, then back at Calvin. "But I saw something in you. I saw you stand against that overseer. I see you risking your all to bring us to this place. So I will trust you, Reverend. I will trust that God placed you here to aid us. We will wait." Tears threatened Calvin's composure. He nodded again, wordless. The others made ready to leave. Thomas, Ruth, Esther, Uncle James, and the rest. They gathered their scant possessions, steeling themselves. Joseph organized them into 3 discrete groups, issued hushed directions. One by one, they ascended from the cellar. Each glanced back at Sarah and Grace, a silent communion of solidarity and fear passing between them. Then they were gone, dissolving into the pre-dawn gloom. Calvin watched them vanish, Joseph leading the way, 12 souls gambling everything on the promise of freedom. He prayed he had chosen rightly. He returned to the cellar, now feeling cavernous and empty, with only Sarah and Grace remaining. "How long do you suppose?" Sarah asked. Calvin did not insult her with a false assurance. "I cannot say. But I swear to you I will not let them take you back." Sarah nodded, her attention returning to Grace. "My mama told me stories of freedom, said there was a place up north where colored folk could walk upright, belong to themselves. I thought they were just tales, wishful thinking. But now I have this child. I cannot let her grow as I did. I will not." Calvin sat with them as dawn broke. Margaret brought sustenance. They maintained absolute silence, the cellar a tomb like heaven. Above them, the world continued unaware. Farmers passed by. A man came to inquire if the Reverend had noticed anything amiss in the night. Calvin lied with smooth conviction, claiming deep sleep. The man eyed him with suspicion but departed. By midday, the news had electrified the county. 12 slaves had absconded from 3 plantations. Cyrus Thornhill was offering a substantial reward. Patrols swarmed. White conversation fixated on the outrage. Calvin preached that Sunday as usual. He stood in his pulpit and spoke of mercy and judgment, the narrow gate and the arduous path. He surveyed his congregation, farmers and their wives, people who owned no slaves but who inhabited a world defined by slavery, and wondered what they would do if they knew what lay secreted beneath their very feet. After the service, Cyrus Thornhill himself materialized in the churchyard. His pale eyes swept the grounds, searching for what he sensed but could not see. He approached Calvin with a smile devoid of warmth. "Reverend Fletcher, I presume you have heard concerning my misplaced property." "I have heard talk, Mr. Thornhill. You have my sympathies for your loss." Thornhill's gaze was analytical, cold. "You northern-bred men sometimes harbor peculiar notions regarding property rights. I trust you comprehend how matters are ordered here." "I comprehend the law, sir." "Good, for should I discover that anyone has facilitated the flight of my property, I will see them hanged. Church or no church." The Thornhill turned and left. The threat hung in the air, palpable and malignant. The ensuing days were an excruciating marathon of tension. Each morning Calvin awoke braced for discovery. Each night he lay listening for the tramp of boots, the shout of accusation. Sarah and Grace existed as phantoms in the cellar, inhabiting a darkness that felt increasingly sepulchral. Margaret became their tether to the world above, bringing nourishment, assisting with the baby, her own hands beginning to betray a constant, fine tremor. Sarah spoke little at first, her entire being focused on preserving silence and sustaining Grace. But on the 4th night, as Calvin checked on them, her fortitude fissured. "I cannot endure this much longer," she confessed, her voice a strained whisper. "This darkness, this not knowing it is breaking something inside me." Calvin had no platitudes. He sat on the cold earthen floor. "I know this is not the freedom you fled toward, but you are alive. Grace is alive. That is not nothing." Sarah's eyes, old with suffering, met his. "Is it not, Reverend? Is mere survival sufficient when this is the shape it must take?" The question haunted him. Was survival enough, or did humanity demand something more? A dignity that had been systematic and denied to Sarah and millions like her. On the 6th day, Joseph returned with news. 10 of the 12 had reached Tennessee safely, dispersed and moving north. "And the other 2? Calvin asked, already dreading the answer. "Apprehended near Huntsville. Returned in irons." Thomas was one. Calvin closed his eyes. Thomas, with his determined limp. Thornhill, purchased them both. He intends to make them examples. They both understood the implications: public floggings, possibly mutilation, a ghastly warning. Calvin relayed the news to Sarah. She did not weep. She merely held Grace tighter. "That might have been me," she said, her voice flat. "That might have been my child. But it was not. You are here." Sarah emitted a joyless sound. "Here. In a hole in the earth. A fine meaning for here." The following weeks were a perpetual performance. Calvin maintained his pastoral duties, a model of normalcy, while beneath the floorboards, a woman and child lived in suspended animation. Thornhill's men searched the area twice more, their boots echoing above the hidden cellar door. Each time they passed over it. Then Grace fell ill. A fever took hold, the baby fretful and hot. In the confines of the cellar, a crying sick infant was a potential death sentence. Medicine was required, but obtaining it risked exposure. Through Joseph's network, a febrifuge was secured, delivered with a terse message: they must move soon. "This situation is untenable." The medicine broke Grace's fever, but the crisis had underscored their precariousness. They could not remain forever. The precipice arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April. Calvin heard the drumbeat of multiple horsemen approaching at speed. Through the window, he saw Thornhill at the head of 6 armed men. Calvin's body turned to ice. He positioned himself in the church doorway. "Mr. Thornhill, gentlemen, to what do I owe this visit?" Thornhill's expression was stone. "We have intelligence you may be harboring fugitives, Reverend. We intend to search the premises." "On whose authority?" "On my authority. The law grants me the right to recover my property, and I have cause to believe you are obstructing that right." "What cause?" That is not your concern. Step aside." Calvin did not move. He thought of Sarah and Grace below, of Margaret, of all the sermons on righteous defiance. "I cannot permit you to search this house of God without proper legal warrant. This sanctuary demands respect." One of Thornhill's men stepped forward, hand on his pistol. Thornhill raised a staying hand, his chilling smile returning. "You are either remarkably brave or profoundly foolish, preacher. I shall determine which. But mark me, if I learn you have abetted runaways, no sanctuary on earth will shield you. Do you understand?" "I understand that I am a minister, and this is my church." The moment stretched, taut and lethal. Calvin awaited the shove, the violent search, the end. Instead, Thornhill wheeled his horse. "Search the surrounding woods, every outbuilding within a mile. Bring them to me, alive if possible." They dispersed. Calvin stood, his legs weak, watching them go. The reprieve was so narrow it felt like a phantom. Inside, Margaret found him ashen. "We cannot continue this," she whispered. "It will kill us." "I know. What would you have me do?" Calvin looked at the cross above the altar. He thought of Sarah's lullabies in the dark, of Thomas in chains. "We get them out. At the first possible moment, we get them north." Pa Joseph brought the new plan that very night. The vigilance in Tennessee had eased. A wagon with a concealed compartment would depart in 3 days. It was perilous, but it was their best, perhaps only chance. Sarah received the news with a complex wave of relief and dread. 3 more days in the cellar, then a journey more hazardous than any prior step. But it was motion. It was hope. Those final 72 hours were an eternity of strained nerves. On the eve of their departure, Sarah posed the question that had lingered between them. "Reverend, why did you do this?" "Risk all for strangers." Calvin considered. He recalled the overseer's whip, the sermons on loving one's neighbor, the reckoning he would one day face before his God. "Because it was right," he said simply. "Because I could not call myself a follower of Christ and do otherwise." Sarah nodded. "Most white preachers don't see it so." "I reckon," Calvin said, a faint smile touching his lips. "If my Jesus overturned tables for those exploiting doves, he would not begrudge me hiding folks seeking to be free." For the first time in weeks, Sarah smiled in return. A fragile, radiant thing. The wagon came at the witching hour. Joseph drove, another silent man beside him. Calvin brought Sarah and Grace up into the cool, star-filled night. Sarah paused, drinking in the air, the vastness of the sky. Margaret pressed a bundle into her hands. "Provisions, a change of clothes, a little money. For your new beginning," she murmured. Sarah looked at her, then at Calvin. "Thank you." The words were a benediction. They helped Sarah and Grace into the hidden compartment. A claustrophobic space of absolute darkness and absolute trust. Calvin saw the terror in Sarah's eyes as the false panel was secured. "God go with you," he breathed. Then the wagon rolled away, swallowed by the night. Calvin and Margaret waited, a vigil of prayer and agonizing silence. Days bled into weeks with no word. Life in Limestone County assumed its grim normalcy. Thornhill's visits ceased. Then, 2 months later, a letter arrived, passed through many hands. Calvin recognized Joseph's hand beneath the anonymous script. The package arrived safely. 2 items, both in good condition. "They are with friends now, learning to live in their new home. The woman wishes you to know her daughter will grow up free. She will never know chains. And that is because of you." Calvin read the message until he had memorized it. Then he burned it, watching the evidence turn to ash, preserving only the knowledge within. Sarah and Grace were free. That Sunday, he preached on the Exodus, on deliverance, the wilderness, and the promised land. He preached with his entire broken, joyful heart laid bare. Some in his congregation shifted uncomfortably, others met his gaze with a new, solemn understanding. In the 2 years that followed, Calvin Fletcher, with Joseph as his guide, assisted 7 more souls toward freedom. Some made it, 1 did not. He worked on, believing each life saved justified the risk. The war came in 1861 and the world he knew convulsed and fell. Calvin lived to see emancipation, to see the institution he had secretly fought dismantled by public cataclysm. He never learned what became of Sarah and Grace, their new names, their specific joys. The railroad's strength was its secrecy. But in his later years, he would often imagine a woman, free, watching her daughter, and perhaps her daughter's children, grow in liberty, their lineage of freedom rooted in a forgotten Alabama cellar. Calvin Fletcher died in 1869, weary from a life of quiet tension and profound faith. Margaret was at his side. Their headstone bore a simple, uncompromising epitaph: "He risked everything." And somewhere, in a place he never knew, a woman named Sarah told her daughter Grace, and Grace told her children, the story of the preacher who hid them in the darkness, who chose to be a light. A story passed down, a testament that even in the deepest night, some souls will always choose to strike a match. If this story of courage and conscience resonated with you, please share it to ensure such tales are never forgotten. For more narratives that explore the hidden histories and moral complexities of our past, subscribe to Tales of Slavery and join us as we illuminate the shadows of history.